Hello, everyone. I am Samuel Ryman. This is Samuel's Racing Show, and I am joined from Colorado by Dre Peak.
Hey, Sam, glad to be back once again.
Absolutely. Now, Joe, I know there's a lot of people discussing, Lewis Hamilton has tied Michael Schumacher on 91 race wins. A lot of people like to argue, oh, which driver was better? But at the end of the day, they raced in two different eras of the sport pretty much, and it's impossible to compare them.
It's always going to be subjective. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, especially in talks like these. But I mean, we can still have fun with it. If anything, it is fun to be able to kind of see the differences and try and equate in our minds, well, what's this worth and what's that worth?
I was going to say, because if we wanted to agree, we could end this episode right now. Goodbye, everyone. See you all next week. But no, exactly. That's not where the fun is it? All
Yeah.
right, so let's give a little bit of a background on both sides. I grew up a Michael Schumacher fan in the 1990s, him in the red Ferrari, and then I enjoyed it in 2000 when he finally won his first championship after coming close so many years, and he didn't win the championship with Ferrari. And then he won the championship with Ferrari a whole bunch of times until Formula One started to put in some regulations to kind of make it a bit more competitive. Ferrari then stopped winning as much. Schumacher retired, came back, and then left permanently. I've still followed Formula One throughout the years, but I remember obviously as a kid, I grew up a Schumacher fan and I was much more invested during those younger years. Oh, how's Schumi going to do and all that? And, now that I've grown up, I enjoy the sport more for what it is rather than just one particular driver. Now, Joe, I know you've followed Formula One for a long time, but I believe you really started coming in at the end of 2000s when Hamilton was on the uprise.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird parallel to yours, except for the fact that I was a lot older. I was in my mid 20s when I started watching F1. And it's kind of the same way you were with Shumi. I started watching in 2009, which was not the greatest year for for Hamilton, and kind of the start of before he came back with Mercedes. He was still good, kind of like how Schumacher would get wins here and there. But then, there's the dominance that Mercedes have had. So we've got similar experiences in that sense. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how that affects our takes on them.
So, my first complaint when Lewis Hamilton started racking up all the wins and people were saying, oh, he's going to beat Schumacher's record, the first thing I had against that was there's more races per year than what there were back in the day. Michael Schumacher got 91 career wins when there were normally only 16, 17 races a season. Whereas with Lewis Hamilton, the schedule nowadays tends to be more 2021 races. However, even though there is some truth to that doesn't bug me as much nowadays because when you look at the win percentage between the two, it's actually quite similar.
Yeah, and it would almost be better in favor of Schumacher if it wasn't for him coming back as well. So he could even have better numbers than that. So I think one of the things that you also have to consider, and I'm sure this will be a little weird since I'm kind of arguing against Hamilton in this case, is I think Hamilton does have a more dominant car than Schumi ever had. The Ferraris were very good and the team was very good, but they never quite had it the way that Mercedes has in these last 6 years.
I think we've definitely seen something we haven't before with the hybrid era of Formula One. That being said, there was a Reddit post, Formula One Reddit post a couple months ago where someone was asking how has Mercedes gotten this dominant, and someone pointed out that it was because Mercedes got the right people together at the right time. They realized there was a massive regulation change coming in 2014, and they got all the right people behind it. Now, Ferrari did something very similar in 96, 97 when Schumacher went to the team and Jean Todt and Ross Brawn. But to my understanding from listening to an episode of Beyond the Grid, I can't remember which one, that wasn't necessarily Ferrari's initiative. They didn't make that happen. It was kind of Bernie Ecclestone poking them with a stick saying, hey, want Ferrari to be successful and you other guys to do it. So But yeah, like you say, I do find it interesting how Hamilton and Schumacher's careers are paralleled because until what Schumacher joined F1 in 91 and then he won his third championship in 2000. So that's 9 years over which he only won two championships. Hamilton, something similar. He entered Formula One in 2007, and then his Mercedes dominance didn't really start until 2014. I think he only won one championship during that time. So it both took him a little while to get all the correct ingredients in place for their dominance to show itself.
It's kind of funny too because it feels like maybe both of them needed to mature a little in a way to kind of pull themselves together as complete drivers, and they've even, I think, both continued to do that uh, through their successful periods. Both Schumi and Hamilton still continued to grow and improve and show themselves to pick up skills, which I've heard a lot of people say that's one of the things that always amazes them is that it's that they don't sit still. Everything is always a march forward for them, which I think is probably a testament to why they've both been so successful. It's not just a case of, well, I've hit this is good enough. It's always got to be better.
And I definitely think you see that in the fact that Lewis Hamilton is performing pretty much flawlessly nowadays. Every now and then he makes a mistake or the team makes a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes.
Yeah.
I can tell you this shirt from Sim Racing merch. Being an iRacing driver, I make mistakes, and I've done over 1,300 starts on iRacing. So, it definitely still happens. And I think you could argue with that with Schumacher as well. Had he continued into 2007, 2008, he was still performing pretty well. He could have won another championship or two, definitely more races. Uh, but it didn't happen. He was starting to feel burned out. I almost think that's going to be the end of Lewis Hamilton's career is when he starts to feel burned out, and that could be coming within the next couple of years. So I'm almost wondering if Hamilton wins his eighth championship next year and he's got nothing else to prove. He's beaten all the records and he doesn't like the look of the 2022 regulations. Does he pull out then? Uh, I don't know.
I mean, if I was him, I probably would, but then I have a completely different mindset than him, and that's where I was a little disappointed when Shumi did come back because again, it was kind of like, well, what do you have to prove? And if anything, it probably did a little more harm to his reputation than good for it. There's a lot to be said for ending while you're on top. As much as people give flack to Nico Rosberg, I actually have a lot of admiration for him quitting when he did because he achieved what he wanted to and said, now's the time where I take care of me, of those around me, and say, this is good enough. Because at some point you probably should reach that and it'll leave you with a much better reputation, if anything, because there is not that down period where, either your stats are hurt or your image is hurt and everybody remembers your best season as your last.
I think children watching Formula One might not necessarily understand why Rosberg retired as much as adults did. As you grow up, you begin to learn, hey, there's more to life than racing cars and building a superhero image for yourself. And I think that was a very mature decision Rosberg made. That hey, I've done what I set out to do, and let then left. But it is a brilliant segue, Joe, onto the next part of the argument that everyone always likes to bring up is how do Schumacher and does Hamilton compare to their teammates? So let's go through Michael Schumacher's teammates. He started with the likes of Jos Verstappen and Martin Brundle, drivers that were good, maybe not necessarily great. Then obviously he had Eddie Irvine, okay, and but through the majority of his wins and his championships, Michael Schumacher's teammate was Rubens Barrichello, and I think that was a worthy foe.
He was, yeah. I think the thing about Rubens, though, is as a lot of people point out, he was very compliant. though, and I think that's what helped Shumi a lot. We could probably argue to the cows come home about who deserved what win, because that's one of those tricky discussions in terms of this, because he's been handed a number of them just by team orders, but then he also handed a few over by team orders. So
Yeah.
you could argue that it weighed itself out. I think overall, I think the talent pool has been a little bit higher against Hamilton more times, not constantly. Uh, I think between Rosberg and you look at Alonso, uh, he's had to face against the best of the best in some cases, against other world champions, something Schumacher never had. So, well, actually, I take that back. Was he in with Nelson
No,
Piquet?
no. I think to build on the argument you're making, I think Damon Hill was okay. Jacques Villeneuve was okay. I think, and Michael Schumacher agreed with us back in his day. Mika Hakkinen was his strongest ever rival, maybe even David Coulthard, but I think Mika Hakkinen. And the fact that Mika Hakkinen retired early in his career, much like the fact Nico Rosberg retired early in his career against Lewis Hamilton, allowed Schumacher to win more races and championships than he probably would have otherwise.
That's actually a good point. I didn't even think about that, because if you look at Ross, after Rosberg left, suddenly Hamilton is sweeping the floor a lot of times. I mean, we've seen Valtteri take his share of wins, but nothing like what Rosberg was doing against him for most of the seasons that he was up against Lewis. In fact, their first season together, I want to say Nico won 2 to Lewis's 1, didn't he?
Yeah, I think during the peak of their rivalry, it was about 50-50. And that wasn't just on race performances, that was qualifying performances as well. I think it Hamilton was still the better all-around driver. But obviously the fact that he had that mechanical failure at the Malaysian Grand Prix kind of handed things over the Rosberg. Of course, the counter argument to that is championship before Rosberg suffered from a little bit more bad luck and unreliability than Hamilton did. So, you know, it comes
It,
and
it
goes.
swings both ways,
Yeah.
yeah. And yeah, there's the always, well, this is the one defining moment. I think it's a critical moment, and a lot of seasons and championships have those. But I agree with those that say that there are always other situations. Well, what if they had won this one? What if they had finished one position up on this one? So you can't just put it down to, oh, this killed their championship, sort of thing. So Lewis had other opportunities throughout that season, and I think Nico just played the game better that year. And like I said, full credit to him.
And he knew what he had to do. He knew what he had to do at the end of the year was finish second to Hamilton's wins each time, and that's what he did. And that was still a tough task in itself because Red Bull were challenging from behind and all that. But let's touch on reliability a little bit. I think Lewis Hamilton, I agree with you here. I think Lewis Hamilton has had more difficult drivers to face than Michael Schumacher did. Back in Schumacher's day, Schumacher brought a whole new level to Formula One. All the drivers now realized, oh, we have to be physically fit. We have to live and breathe Formula One and a daily routine in order to make sure we're on the peak of our performance every single race. Before Schumacher and honestly before Senna as well came along, drivers weren't necessarily doing that. Nowadays, everyone does it. If you don't do it, you can't drive a Formula One car pretty much. So I think Lewis Hamilton does have the disadvantage of tougher competition. But on the flip side of that, I think Lewis Hamilton has had the advantage of more reliable cars.
I would
But
actually, yeah, I completely agree with you on that one. If you look at the number of finishers and up until I think it's like the late 2000s, besides a few blips with like the early hybrid eras, uh, basically the last 20 years have been incredibly reliable with F1. And I think part of that is due to the limits that they now have with the testing and everything, and advancements on engines and all those various things.
yeah, although It was interesting seeing a bit of attrition this weekend, thanks in part, perhaps, to the fact that we didn't have Friday practice because of weather. And I know that's something you've always been a fan of, Joe. We're cutting back on practice time, and we get to see if that repeats itself in a few weeks, rather, Imola.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of hope it does. I hope it throws up an interesting race because I think even though if you give less track time with the practice for fans and stuff, that is a downside. But the upside of limiting that practice also makes it cheaper in a sense. It's because the less time the cars are running, the less expensive it is. There's a lot of parts and wear and tear and expendables and whatnot that come with that. But we're getting off topic. I know we're supposed to talk about Hamilton and Schumacher.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's really one thing left to cover here in the discussion, and that is looks like Lewis Hamilton is going to win the championship this year. Does he do something Michael Schumacher couldn't do and win an eighth world title next year? And before you answer yes, I've noticed in multiple sports, and okay, I can only think of three, but seven seems to be as far as you can go with championship wins. And the three examples I want to pick for that are NASCAR, Richard Petty, Dale Earnhardt, and Jimmy Johnson. They're all tied on seven. No one's ever won eight. MotoGP, Valentino Rossi has only ever won seven titles in the Premier class. And here we are in Formula One. Michael Schumacher sits on seven. Lewis Hamilton looks like he's going to get seven. But can he break that kind of curse of a seventh title?
Right now, it looks like it, but like you said, I mean, that is an interesting coincidence, a statistic that's been happening in racing for a long time. Um, I think I think the only thing that could throw him off is like we just
COVID?
talked about. Yeah, that could that
Yeah.
could. No, I was going to say, something like reliability next season, or if Bottas comes back just, a monster and just does what Nico Rosberg did and said, my entire focus now is going to be taking the championship and nothing else. Um, or potentially, if one of the other teams strikes it lucky, which I'd be extremely shocked if we saw a team suddenly have a sudden rise in 2021, just because I'm pretty certain all of them are going to be focusing on 2022 with the regulation changes. So there's still some possibility that could throw it out, but right now the chances are looking good for him taking an eighth, to me at least.
It was nice to see Bottas take a fight to Hamilton in the first chicane at the Nürburgring, the Eiffel Grand Prix, which happened this weekend. But then also it was disappointing to see Bottas absolutely throw it away about 10 laps later by locking up in the first hairpin, and kind of a reminder that Hamilton's a better all-around driver. Um, do we want to answer the question, Joe? Which driver was better, or are we not gonna we're not gonna poke that? Because honestly, I'm almost tempted to say Hamilton.
Uh, I I don't want to say that he's the better one, not to be opposite to you, but more because I don't think I can answer the question. I feel like it is too difficult, and I think F1 makes it too difficult by its very nature, just because of the fact that the car is always different. IndyCar, it's a lot easier to look and say everyone, especially in modern age, maybe not so much before, but with everybody in the same machinery, about the only difference is the teams, which can make a difference, but uh, you still see the best drivers tend to flock to those teams over time. So F1 just is too complex to try and say, oh, this driver was better and this driver is better. Because I do think there are those over the years that didn't get the shot that maybe they should have. They didn't have the funding, or they didn't have the connections, or they just weren't there at the right time. I think that Alonso probably could have won a lot more championships if he had been in the right team at the right time. Poor guy just did not make the best of choices.
I am also tempted. Okay, I'm going to take a page out of Maury Walker's book here. Maury Walker, for the longest time, always argued that Juan Manuel Fangio was the best driver of all time, and I think one of his reasonings behind that is due to the fact that when Formula One started in 1950, Fangio had already pretty much lived through his 20s, where, had Formula One been a sport in the 1940s, Fangio could have been a 8, 9, 10-time champion or something. He was actually doing an incredible job to win all those championships at the age at which he competed at. Obviously, the competition level probably wasn't as tough back then, but the cars were hard to drive and all that. But Maury Walker recently argued that he would almost be tempted to put Hamilton ahead of Senna and Schumacher on the basis that Hamilton has been less of a controversial driver, an all-around driver. There's no moment in time where you could pinpoint a move that Hamilton made and say, "Oh, he shouldn't have done that." I would
I
almost
could think of a number of them, but
yeah,
go
yeah.
on.
I'm going to say, I was about to counter that. That there are a few times where Hamilton ran Rosberg off the track, and I recall, I think 2008, him and Felipe Massa had like 4 crashes. And I can't remember every crash in detail over who was to blame from which one, but Hamilton definitely wasn't completely blameless. But I'll open the floor to that on you, Joe, if you want to discuss, because I'll also share the fact that I don't think Hamilton has had to be as aggressive as Schumacher did, because most of the cars are behind him most of the time.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's part of it, a big part of it, and usually it's with his teammate. And honestly, if you look at a lot of those controversial moments, they typically are with teammates. With Alonso, you see that one. You see with Rosberg, even a few with Valtteri that he's had. Not as much, but you can tell there's times where it's like, you know. Uh, so I put them even in some ways. I do think Schumacher was a little more ruthless than Hamilton, not quite as concerned with fair play, I think, in a few cases. But like you said, I don't think Hamilton is absolutely blameless. And there's definitely been some times where I could not side with him with the way that he operated. When you mentioned uh, Rosberg picking up his championship and had to win second, that's one case where
Yeah.
I would have rather seen Hamilton just run off into the distance and win the race and accept that he had lost it instead of trying to play silly games and back him up. But that's me. I know that that's kind of how it has to be done if he wants to win it. So that's my kind of take. I put Hamilton only mildly above Schumacher in terms of sportsmanship. I shouldn't say mildly above. More above than Schumacher in sportsmanship, but not call him an angel.
Yeah. All right, final question, and I think I've said that a couple of times already, but this one's the last one I can think of. Who breaks Hamilton's record? And before we get to that question, I'll point out a point that virtual statman Sean Kelly pointed out on Twitter yesterday. I think that it had been 14 years since Schumacher got his record and Hamilton surpassed it, and before Schumacher, it had been like 14 years since Prost had set his record and Schumacher surpassed it. So there seems to be a recurring theme here. So who is on the rise now that will surpass Hamilton's, however many wins Hamilton ends up with in 14 years? Is it Mick Schumacher? Is it someone else? Or is it someone we don't even know yet?
I mean, the obvious one, I'm sure you're already thinking, is Verstappen seems one likely able to try and do it. I feel like Leclerc has potential. Um, I think if Leclerc gets himself in the right team, whether he sticks with Ferrari and Ferrari rebounds or, he goes somewhere else, he's very good. I think in the right cars, he could be pretty dominant as much as we've seen both Verstappen and Hamilton. I'm also curious because you brought up that 14-year stat. I'm trying to do the math in my head. When did I think was it Clark that held it before Prost?
I think it might have been Jackie Stewart.
That's what I was trying to figure out if it
Yeah.
was Stewart or Prost. So Stewart's could have been no, it was way more than 14
The
years. That would have
the
been 20
tweet
plus.
the tweet is on Sean Kelly at virtual statman.
Okay.
You can scroll
Oh
through
yeah,
it.
I'll go and look
Yeah,
at it. But
our followers can scroll through it and try and find it. But it's an interesting stat. So what year would that be? 2034.
Well, if he does it in 2021, are we talking wins or are we talking championships?
Wins.
Wins.
Yeah.
So yeah, 2034.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So
okay.
Formula One might be all electric by then.
So well, here's what's interesting to think about. Okay, so if we're looking for somebody who's going to break it, because most of them broke it in what, their mid 30s, early 30s, mid
Yeah.
30s, thereabouts. So it would have to be someone who was born around between 2002 and 2010 or something like that,
So
essentially,
someone who's a teenager. So someone in Formula 3 right now.
right
Maybe
now.
it'll be Sargent, the American.
Hey, that would be fantastic. We
Yeah.
need another Mario Andretti very badly, very,
Yeah.
very badly.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's it? I get them confused. They are related. There's a Dalton Sargent and a Logan Sargent, and one's over in NASCAR and one's in Formula 3.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I'll have
Yeah.
to look into that. Huh.
Yeah, but yeah, hopefully Sargent then will, because he's been doing well in Formula 3. I think he was runner-up in the championship. So hopefully that's bought him a Formula 2 ride for next season, and we'll have an American in F1 again very soon. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
And if not, someone else to fight for Indy 500 victories alongside
Yeah.
Alexander Rossi.
Very true.
Yeah.
IndyCar does seem to bring the Americans over once if it doesn't work out in the European series, which I'm okay with, honestly, because it seems to sharpen them pretty well.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was Lewis Hamilton getting his 91st Formula One career win. And Joe and I just discussing it here, how his accomplishments compared to that of Michael Schumacher. We'll see if Hamilton can pick up win number 92 in 2 weeks' time at Portimao in Portugal. That will be an interesting race to watch. Until then, Formula One's got a week off. So there's MotoGP this weekend, NASCAR as well. And IndyCar in a couple of weeks' time. I'm looking forward to that, Joe. That'll be my first ever time at an IndyCar race.
Ah, well,
Go to
enjoy
St. Pete.
yourself.
Yeah,
That'll,
that'll be fun.
let's see, I'm trying to think how many I've gone to at this point because I've done 9 Indy 500s, I think. And then I did, well, anyways, that's a discussion for another time. But yeah, no, IndyCar races are so much fun. Definitely enjoy yourself, and I think you'll have a good time.
And I'll try and get up a trackside edition of Samuel's Racing Show that week. Until now, we're stuck here. All right. Well, thanks for coming along, Joe, and hope you enjoyed the race last weekend, and enjoy all the on-track action coming up.
Same to you, bud.
We'll see you all around.